You all can now go to our next session, which is the Global Digital Order with Martijn Rasser, and he's going to take it away. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Yaya. Hello, everyone. We are well on our way in day one of the CNAS annual conference. Great to see you all. Welcome to our session on the Global Digital Order. The Global Digital Order is the networks we use to communicate, the social media we use to express ideas, and the norms, rules, and standards we set for how to manage those and how to use those technologies. So what countries lead the way in shaping that digital order will have tremendous influence over whether the world will be more open and free or one where oppression and control is the norm. So we're going to tackle some key questions about what to look out for as our physical and digital worlds blend, as high-tech liberalism spreads, and what democratic countries can do to shape our digital future. It's about how to best counter disinformation, how to make sure the networks we use to connect and do business over are secure and resilient, how to restrict surveillance technology, and much, much more. And you can be a part of it. We'll kick things off with a round of trivia, test your knowledge of digital tech concepts and trends, and from there we'll go to a panel discussion where you have the opportunity to ask us questions. So let's get started and pass the mic to Megan and Ainikki, your hosts for our trivia game, Digital Pursuit.
Thanks so much, Martin, for the very kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ainikki Riikonen, a research assistant on the CNAS Technology and National Security Program.
And I'm Megan Lamberth, a research associate on the tech team and Ainikki's partner in crime for the first part of today's session called Digital Pursuit, Trivia Towards an Open Future. Before we turn to a discussion with our panel, Ainikki and I would like to test your knowledge on a range of topics in digital space. Over the next few minutes, we'll ask a series of trivia questions on topics that represent wrinkles in the global digital order, challenges and solutions in internet freedom, telecommunications, data privacy, cybersecurity, and more. And we welcome and encourage you to play along with us. If you're tuning in at cnas.org/live, please join the chat below or to the right of your video screen to vote for what you think is the correct answer to each trivia question. And if you're having trouble accessing the poll, please try refreshing the webpage and it should allow you to vote. You can also use the chat function to interact with other audience members and with us. We would love to hear your reactions throughout. And finally, you can engage with us on Twitter by using the hashtag CNAS2021. And with that, let's get things started. And remember, no Googling the answers.
All right, everyone, I hope you're all ready. Megan and I certainly have been all day. Here's our first question. Which country was responsible for the highest number of internet shutdowns in 2018, 2019, and 2020? Was it A, Vietnam, B, India, C, Brazil, or D, Russia? And we'll give everyone about 15 seconds or so to vote.
And Ainikki, this is such an important question because internet governance is so hotly contested. And this question of what does internet freedom or privacy look like in countries with a variety of different governing models and institutions.
Right, and to pull on even just that privacy thread a little bit more, I think what's so interesting about this is that it's contested even among democracies. I mean, looking at data privacy, in the US, we actually don't have federal level privacy legislation. The EU has GDPR, love it or hate it, and then Australia is looking at regulating encryption. But with this question, we're actually wondering, can you even get online?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it looks like a good portion of people are voting. So if you voted for B, India, you are correct. India is in fact responsible for the highest number of internet shutdowns for 3 years in a row in 2018, 2019, and 2020, including some of the longest recorded in a democracy. And these shutdowns have taken place in Jammu and Kashmir, with the Indian government citing unrest in the region.
Just goes to show even democracies may resort to illiberal measures sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, great job, everyone. We're all warmed up. Before we move on to our next question, if you're just now joining us, my name is Megan Lamberth. I'm here with my colleague Ainikki, and we are hosting a trivia exercise on the global digital order. So please feel free to jump on in and vote using the chat feature on your screen. All right, so our second question is, the switchboard is analogous to what component of modern telecommunications networks? Is it A, the edge, B, the core, C, Alexa, or D, radio access network? We'll give everyone a few seconds to vote. In the meantime, Ainikki, can you tell us what's going on in this picture to the side?
Yes, Megan, you know, I'm a sucker for analog comparisons. So if you see in this picture right here, that's an old school switchboard, which is used to direct traffic from one part of a network to another. And we used to do this manually by physically plugging you in. The other way I like to think about this is if you've ever had a FedEx package going from downtown DC to DuPont or Columbia Heights and wondered, you know, why is this thing getting routed through Tennessee? I'm going to miss my package. That's actually where the sorting equipment is. And so it's like a big switchboard. It takes trans-network traffic, reads the address, and then sends it onwards to its destination.
I love that. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That's cool. So for Ainikki, for this one, what is our answer?
All right, team, if you picked the core, you would be correct. The core fulfills this function, among others, by directing traffic from one part of the network to another. This is a rough approximation of how networks function, but as things get more advanced, 5G adds another element. In the future, telecoms networks will run more like when a courier knows it can really actually just take the package directly down the street. And we call this the diffusion of the core towards the edge. It's why the UK reversed on its proposal to keep risky vendors out of its 5G core, because this distinction will actually gradually dissolve with time. Bringing us to our next question. Maybe there's a little bit of hope for us after all. And this question is, which of these technologies lets AI systems train on biometric recognition while preserving privacy? If you're just joining us, feel free to hop over to cnas.org/live and vote for the answer in the chat function. Is the answer A, passwords, B, federated learning, C, distributed ledger, or D, deep neural nets? I like this question because, Megan, we were just talking about this the other day.
That we were, Ainikki, which means that we're obviously a lot of fun at parties. So that's
so
cool.
Fun.
And so there's a lot of debate, right now around the use of biometric systems like facial recognition, which I'm sure many people in our audience have followed, or voice recognition, because of concerns over its potential use for surveillance or potential discriminatory uses.
Right. So here in the US, we've seen a few cities regulate or ban the use of facial recognition by municipal government agencies or police departments. And while technical solutions might not solve every issue, I really like this expression, you can't algorithm your way out of bias, but it can help for some specific use cases.
Right. Exactly. And in this case, for the purpose of our question, if you guessed federated learning, you are correct, and kudos, because this was kind of a tricky one. And as we were just saying, biometric systems create privacy concerns in a lot of different contexts, but there are technical solutions that may exist in some cases. And so let's say, for example, that your phone uses machine learning to better recognize your voice. With federated learning, you train the system that lives locally in your device. And it does update a master model that lives centrally somewhere else, but only sends the lessons learned. It doesn't send the raw data of what you said or sound like, which is pretty neat. All right, everyone. So moving on to our next question on the SolarWinds hack. Our question is, the SolarWinds hack used which of these cyber operations tactics? Was it A, phishing, B, insider threat, C, watering hole, or D, supply chain attack? Let's take a few. Let people vote.
If you can hear that in the background, I've got my sirens calling out cyber operations in the background here. And just a point of clarification on this question, we're not looking for how malicious actors got into the SolarWinds company itself, but the entry into US government networks is what we're after. So one thing I love is analog comparisons. The other thing that I have a passion for is supervillain toolkits. So I'll just walk you through some of these. A, phishing. It's a shady email with a malicious attachment or link. So just think in your head and from the chat and show me the crypto, don't open it. B, insider threats. That's when a human person with network access is doing stuff they're not supposed to. Megan, I'm looking at you. A watering hole, that would be the compromise of a website frequented by the target. So let's say CNAS staff love the great panini competition cafe next door. The menu online is compromised. That would cause some significant issues for us. And then D, supply chain attacks. This is when a malicious actor hacks a third party, such as a software provider, so that could be cloud services, antivirus, etc., and then compromises its service to reach the final target. And this is actually a rising trend in cyber operations.
Well, thank you for that, Ainikki, for walking us through what is, in fact, a terrifying toolkit.
No problem.
So for this question in particular, for the SolarWinds hack, what tactic was used?
Well, the answer here, congratulations to the folks who picked this, is D, a software supply chain attack. Supply chain attacks mean that an adversary can breach one technology company to then have access to potentially thousands of victims. But cyber operations are unfortunately only one type of supply chain risk. In some cases, adversaries are actually becoming the supply chain. They're providing the network services, apps, devices, and don't need to conduct a full-fledged cyber operation to get in. Digital development or modernization projects, like some 5G projects, the Digital Silk Road, and others, are becoming an area of geopolitical contest for this reason. And speaking of geopolitical contest, that brings us to our final question, which will tackle the future of the internet itself. This question reads, the Internet Protocol Suite defines the internet. It is a set of rules that directs how data travels through it. Which company has proposed a new IP which could redesign the internet? Is it A, Huawei, B, Vodafone, C, Google, or D, Yandex? And if you're joining us, we are solving, evidently, the global digital order with trivia questions. Please feel free to vote with us at cns.org/live. And while folks are voting, I would note the internet is in its 50s, right? I feel like that's the age I want to start, hitting my stride.
That's right. Yeah, it's truly the best years are yet to come, or at least hopefully for the internet. And what's cool is, so ARPA, which was the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was the predecessor to what we now know as DARPA, built the internet to be open. And so today, international organizations and the representatives that make them up are trying to determine standards for the internet. But these will obviously evolve over time as the internet continues to evolve.
It's true. And I think it's interesting to see this proliferating across different technology areas. You're seeing it in 5G as well. Participation in standards bodies is an emerging area, not just for technical, but geopolitical contest as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect example. So Ainikki, for this one, what's our answer?
The answer to this question is A, Huawei, but also along with some of China's state-owned enterprises and the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. New IP could create more centralized architecture for the internet, one that consolidates power into the hands of a few. Democracies should work together and in coordination with their innovation bases to envision alternatives, a democratic future for the internet.
And the questions presented here today represent just a snapshot of some of the key issues in the digital technology space. And while technology was once thought to become the great democratizer of our age, it's clear that reality looks much different. Technologies that connect people and enable innovation in the exchange of ideas are the very same technologies that can be used to repress societies or undermine human rights.
Exactly. So that's why US leadership in technology is so critical. Technological leadership, how a country invents, innovates, and deploys technologies to compete economically and to secure its interests and values, will shape the future years to a remarkable degree.
In this era of multifaceted strategic competition, the United States and its friends and allies must work together to ensure a global digital order that promotes economic and military competitiveness and safeguards liberal democratic values.
We've asked you all some challenging questions over the last few minutes, and I'm willing to gamble that our speakers in the panel will have some good answers for you. Thank you all so much for participating. And now over to Bryan Walsh for a discussion with our esteemed panel.
So we're here to talk about the international competition to build the infrastructure and set the rules around global technology, which is emerging really as a vital new front for the geopolitical contest for influence, especially in the realm of 5G and digital surveillance. We have an excellent panel with us today. We have Lisa Curtis, who is a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at CNS. She previously served as Deputy Assistant to the President and the NSC Senior Director for South and Central South Asia from 2017 to 2021. We also have Zoe Weinberg, who is a fellow at Schmidt Futures, focused on geopolitics and supporting the Reimagine New York Commission, helping New York State to build back better from COVID-19. She previously worked on ethics and policy at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and at Google AI. We also have Martijn Rasser. He is the Senior Fellow in the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security, which is CNAS. So I'll just start, Lisa, with you. What impact really has the COVID-19 pandemic had on the battle to control and shape the development and distribution, first of digital surveillance technology? Obviously, this has been a world-shaking event, and governments have taken advantage, I think, in some ways to look to how they can use these tools.
Well, that's absolutely right. Let me just start by thanking Megan and Ainikki for that wonderful introduction. And as they mentioned, there's really a competition for influence over the development of digital ecosystems and the norms that will frame those ecosystems throughout the Indo-Pacific. And this will really play a defining role on whether we see liberal or authoritarian governance models prevailing in this region and really globally. And as China is expanding its role in digital ecosystems, developing 5G infrastructure, building digital partnerships, it's also enhancing its ability to conduct sabotage and espionage on that digital infrastructure. It's increasing its economic coercive power, and it's influencing how these technologies are used. And when it comes to surveillance technologies, its export of these technologies really kind of normalizes the illiberal use of that technology because of the way China has been using it, creating this comprehensive architecture in which it can observe and limit the digital activity of its own citizens. So the way this relates to the pandemic is that what we've seen is China combining its digital Silk Road policies with its health Silk Road policies. And it's done this in different ways. For instance, two of its largest surveillance companies, Hikvision and Dahua, have been able to secure contracts for selling thermal imaging equipment in the name of public health. In other cases, China has tied the provision of health items like PPE to a country's willingness to use Chinese companies for its 5G infrastructure. So China really is seeking to use any and all levers of influence to coerce countries into making decisions that support its own geopolitical goals.
So, Martin, I could go to you actually then. So what does the U.S. do in response to that, just to start off with? I mean, we see China taking that initiative. Where does that leave the U.S.?
Yeah, that's an important question, and one that our policymakers are grappling with right now. So I see a few areas, right? One is, of course, addressing the normative issues, and I think in particular working with the like-minded democracies on really setting the rules for the road, what you should and should not do with these types of technologies. If you think of surveillance technologies, how those are being abused in Xinjiang, for example, to really suppress a population in a way that we haven't seen in decades. The other aspect is economic statecraft. A lot of the technologies that China in particular is using to promote that type of high-tech liberalism, a lot of those technologies are actually coming from outside countries, Europe, North America, East Asia. So what can we do with our allies and partners to really constrain China's ability to obtain that type of technology in the first place? And then I think the third step would be to really provide more alternatives to other countries. Now, a lot of these technologies have very legitimate uses, such as for law enforcement. You still want these countries to be able to build out secure networks and that are used properly. Right now, the value proposition from a lot of Chinese technology firms is that at first glance, it appears much more affordable. There's other costs associated with that. We can talk about that later, but I think the point here is that the United States and its partners should come up with investment mechanisms to make it easier for less affluent countries in the Indo-Pacific and Africa, for example, to be able to acquire non-Chinese sources of technologies. That, of course, has great economic benefits for our economies as well. So I think that the three-legged stool type of approach to this issue is a good first step forward. And you can start seeing the United States and its allies already starting to frame policies in that general construct. So I think we'll make a lot of progress on these issues over the course of the coming months and years. But again, I would underscore, as Lisa and Ainikki and Megan already have, that there's a lot of urgency in doing so as well, because the problem is very big and it's developing rapidly.
Zoe, maybe I could ask you, Martin mentions the private companies in Europe, North America that are involved, and that's obviously involved in the making of these infrastructure tools. What's the level of responsibility, or what should be the response for those companies? I mean, their interest might be different than that of the United States and some of its allies, but they're also key. They're key leverage points, I would imagine, for those governments to try to promote their own vision of how the internet should work.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to think about this is that we need to simultaneously be engaging in both the downstream and the sort of upstream responses. And when I say downstream, what I really mean are the largely defensive actions that, are limiting the impact of existing harms. And so, President Biden's decision to expand the ban on investments in Chinese firms linked to the military, I think, is a great example of that. So are, of course, export controls, sanctions against Huawei, et cetera. But, those defensive actions are only so effective. Huawei recently released its annual report, and even though revenue growth has slowed and international sales have dropped, the company, is still growing in new product categories and expanding in new geographies. So I think we need to be realistic about, what will actually stem the tide here. And I think that's where the upstream interventions come into play. And that includes, investment and R&D, which is obviously very top of mind with the Innovation and Competition Act, as well as working with our allies, to Martin's point, and other advanced democracies to align on norms and governance standards. But, I would also say that when you mentioned the private sector, Bryan, and I think when it comes to digital conflict and digital supremacy, it's important to remember that there really is no unified power or centralized control here. Instead, the centers of power within the international system are becoming increasingly diffuse, privatized, transnational, and so both the threats and the power players are as likely to take the form of non-state actors, rogue regimes, corporations, as well as superpower nations. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing now with the recent ransomware attacks and so forth. So to me, the real question isn't simply what can the Biden administration or Congress do to respond, but how do we create the conditions and incentives for all of these diffuse actors, including the private sector, to be rowing in the same direction?
Mm-hmm. Lisa, so let me remind the audience, you can send questions via the chat function. They'll make their way to me. Lisa, I think you mentioned and talked about sort of cost competition. Obviously, there are countries around the world, if Huawei or other Chinese providers can provide lower cost alternatives, they're going to be tempted by those. So I know one key is actually producing cost competitive alternatives from the US and other allied countries. What needs to be done to ensure that those alternatives actually do exist?
Well, I think there are a few things that the U.S. can do in coordination, cooperation with our democratic allies and partners. But I think one of the most important things is incentivizing nations to invest in these trusted and secure technologies. And the U.S. can do things like use the expanded authorities that the International Development Finance Corporation has gained to be able to provide financial support or incentives for U.S. companies or even select companies from allied or partner nations that are well positioned to provide trusted alternatives to the Chinese companies. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing that I think is very important is to develop these assessment frameworks and standards to be able to vet digital development projects. And here, I think we could develop something along the lines of the Blue Dot Network, which was it was a concept that was developed during the Trump administration to certify transparent, sustainable, inclusive infrastructure, hard infrastructure projects. And I think you could do something similar in the digital space. So in my opinion, I think it would be useful if, State Department, USAID, DFC could collaborate on developing such a system to vet digital projects, and then get those standards out there, get countries to sign up, so that they understand the importance of open digital ecosystems and how this is helpful for their economic growth, job creation, innovation, and capacity building. And then third, I think that what we could see is the Commerce Department could work with other U.S. Interagency partners to facilitate investments in Indo-Pacific technology companies themselves that can provide the alternatives to the Chinese capital. So I think, there are steps that we can do. The government can sort of lead these private sector actions. But also it's important for governments to work together. And here I'll cite an example of the US, Australia, and Japan coming together to be able to provide infrastructure alternatives to China. And they were able to sign an MOU. This goes back about 3 years, where the US Development Finance Corporation can work with the Australian DFAT and Japan's Bank of International Cooperation to put together a financing package for alternative investments. And in this case, they did it to finance a subsea cable to Palau, the Pacific island of Palau. But I think this is a good example of countries coming together, figuring out how they can pool their resources and provide financing packages or help support for companies that are competing against some of these Chinese companies.
I have a question from the audience here. And this maybe Martin, you could take this first. What areas should the U.S. engage with China on, and what areas should they try to compete with when it comes to these attempts to build a more liberal global digital order?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, the realm of possibilities for engagement is shrinking pretty rapidly. I would say there's certain areas of in research in artificial intelligence where it would make a lot of sense. So AI safety, for example, for driverless cars, right? It's in no one's interest to have unsafe vehicles on the road anywhere. I think that's one area where we could see some fruitful collaboration. Looking more broadly, green technologies, climate change types of initiatives, some good opportunity there for collaborative work. But given the state of affairs right now, yes, there's unfortunately not a whole lot for us to cooperate on with China, just because of the starkly divergent viewpoints of the normative aspect and just the general distrust that's going on right now. In terms of where the top priorities for really competing with China should be, communications networks are vitally essential, right? And then we're talking about 5G networks, but also the seabed cables. 95% of the world's data traverses seabed cables. Beijing is increasingly assertive in trying to gain a foothold in that industry. So this is something that we need to be very cognizant of, because there's considerable national security and economic security risks associated with that. The other key area is going to be semiconductors, right? Microelectronics are foundational to the 21st century economy. Right now, the United States and other tech-leading democracies have distinct advantages in this industry. These are areas that we need to protect, but we also, as Zoe pointed out earlier, we need to focus on investments in the future, right? We have to focus on R&D, human capital. And there's a lot of movement in Washington right now to do exactly that, right? And a lot of legislation that would provide substantial sums of money to remap supply chains, make those investments in education that we need, next generation R&D. So those would be the areas of focus for the immediate term.
So I know you wanted to respond as well, and also I'd also love to hear your thoughts on, Martin mentioned some of the R&D funding bills going right now. Obviously, the Endless Frontier Act is likely close to passing, but please let me know your thoughts too.
Yeah, I very much agree with Martin that there's some, areas of research and areas like climate change or public health where we might be able to collaborate, but also a lot of areas that present significant security risk. I would actually go a step further and say that we as the US should also lean into technology areas that are sort of deeply and kind of fundamentally aligned with democracy and in many ways incompatible with authoritarianism. To give an example, I think machine learning is a technology that in many ways is actually very well suited to authoritarianism. The CCP has just unparalleled structural advantages here. It has a massive data generating apparatus. It has easy centralization of data through, legal and less than legal means, and it has enormous volumes of that data. And in contrast, there are decentralized platforms that in many ways are more closely aligned with democratic values and are anathema to the CCP because they enable privacy, anti-censorship, free markets, and so forth. And so one of the things I'm very interested in these days is how the move towards decentralized systems and networks, including cryptocurrencies, Web 3.0, decentralized autonomous organizations, IPFS, and so forth, may actually be a means of strengthening democracy and individual rights in a way that would represent a meaningful challenge to China. And then, Bryan, to your question about R&D funding, obviously right now Congress is debating the Innovation and Competition Act. To me, I think that's a really solid step in the right direction, but ultimately I think the devil will be in the details. And I would really like to see investment in technology areas like I described before that are sort of authoritarian resistant and advanced democratic values. For example, I think, in the bill, there's something like 50 plus mentions of artificial intelligence, at least in the Senate version of the bill, but there's only one real reference to privacy preserving machine learning techniques. And the latter is really crucial to us being able to advance, technologies while also preserving individual rights.
We'll jump to another question. This one from the audience. It's from Sam. What's the right balance between advocating for open ecosystems and restricting hate speech, deplatforming dangerous actors, and digital surveillance of extremist groups? Perhaps, Zoe, would you like to take the first crack at that and see what the rest of the panel thinks?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question. I think one thing that's worth keeping an eye on here is consumer technology trends globally, but particularly in the US. I think the national security establishment and Silicon Valley have been caught flat-footed again and again here. TikTok is an obvious example, but I'd also be surprised if anyone at Clubhouse anticipated that it would be used as a forum for resistance in Iran. So I think if we, want to look to the future to sort of understand what are going to be the next frontiers of disinformation or digital conflict or malign influence campaigns, we should probably be looking to Gen Z. And there's these new photo sharing apps like Paparazzi and Dispo and Be Real, which I guess made some headlines last week for its Series A. And I think, those trends may feel sort of far removed from the national security conversation, but they really shouldn't be. And I think there's an interesting trend with a few of those apps, which sort of indicate that people are less focused on public broadcasting of information and care a little bit more about sharing content within private social circles, which may say something about general consumer sensibilities and perhaps a preference for more private forums. And I think some of those consumer preferences will ultimately drive platforms and tech companies in sort of resetting what their privacy baselines are.
Mm-hmm. This is Martin for you. China is not shy about pointing to how what kind of domestic American use there is around digital surveillance here at home. Does the U.S. need to rethink how the government should or shouldn't be employing these kind of tools on its own platform, whether it's in cities, states, or higher level than that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'd say first, obviously the context in which these technologies are used in the United States is very different, right? We have constitutional protections, we have civil liberties that just don't exist in China. So that's one important difference. What I would say is a challenge for the United States, particularly as it seeks to engage with like-minded countries on setting norms for these types of technologies, is, the United States doesn't have a national level approach to this, right? There's no federal data privacy law, for example. Right now, it's the states and local jurisdictions that are starting to come up with their own regulations on, for example, the proper use of facial recognition technology. I think that's one thing that Congress really needs to step up to the plate, roll up their sleeves, and start thinking seriously about what a federal data privacy and data security law should look like, because it is going to be very difficult for us to really help shape what the digital order globally will look like if we have a patchwork of regulations at home right now. So I think that's one key area where there's a lot of need for attention and work. There are some bills being introduced on Capitol Hill. A lot of these are being reintroduced from prior Congresses. So yeah, it's going to be a big challenge, but it's really something that we have to get very serious about, because if you think about more generally just the impact on U.S. technology companies, they have to manage that quilt of regulations that hinders innovation. It hinders their ability to do business in other parts of the world. And we need that type of national level approach in order to be able to start approaching particularly the Europeans on how we can come a little bit closer and bridging the gap on how we view these issues right now.
Lisa, there's a question for you from the audience. I think that this is the United States seems to have made some progress in addressing unwanted technology transfer to China. How can it best persuade allies and partners to adopt similar policies around that?
Well, I think a lot of this is about education and, diplomacy and explaining the importance of protecting our digital ecosystems, and both from a security standpoint, but also, to make sure that technology is not being transferred. So I think that, this really is a lot about diplomacy and explaining why this is so important, and making sure that U.S. government agencies that deal with digital development and ensuring open ecosystems are fully funded. USAID has programs, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, DFC, the Development Finance Corporation. We really sort of need a whole of government approach that focuses on the messaging and the public diplomacy, and also the private diplomacy of our strategy, and explaining, why it is so important. And hopefully this would be sort of an NSC-led process that could bring in a whole of government approach to explaining the importance of digital governance, and then working with our allies and partners. And of course, one of the most important groupings for getting on the same page on this issue is the Quad. This is US, India, Australia, and Japan. And we've already seen that the summit that was held in March, the first ever Quad summit that was held, one of the main issues that they decided they were going to focus on and establish a working group was emerging and critical technologies. So a lot of this is about diplomacy, explaining why we're doing what we're doing, and why it's important for other countries to protect their digital ecosystems, make sure that they're being developed in a way that is going to foster openness, foster competitiveness, innovation, and protect the citizens of their country.
Zoe, I think we have time for one more question I'd love to direct towards you. I mean, we mostly focused on the nuts and bolts of the internet, but you mentioned AI, and obviously you have a lot of background there. That's a technology, as I think you mentioned, that it's actually somewhat worrying the way it's been adapted to rather authoritarian uses. When you look to the future, whether it's in AI or other new emerging technologies there, are there other areas where you worry that there might be something about these tools that actually do adapt them, if not better for authoritarian uses, more so perhaps than we would have hoped for, say, 30 years ago with the dawn of the internet?
I think generally technologies that rely on centralization and scale are often the ones that are not as well suited to either decentralized or sort of democratic states, and where authoritarian governments often have an edge. And so I think being mindful of some of those underlying structural challenges can enable the US to sort of think about ways to advance in AI and machine learning in ways that are consistent with our values. And so I mentioned before, different privacy preserving machine learning techniques. I think that's one area where I would really like to see more investment. But I think, in general, it's often hard to see, beyond the frontier. But I think now we know a little bit more about what are the sort of elements that give certain countries an edge, either in supply chains or in development, or by having sort of big pipelines of talent, and how can we create the conditions to enable us to succeed across a whole variety of technology spaces, regardless of how they sort of evolve over time in unforeseen ways.
Great. Well, thank you to CNAS and to our panelists, Zoe, Martin, and Lisa, for this amazing panel.